We are back with Jeff Jacobs. If you did not listen to our first mini episode with Jeff, you'll want to go back so you can learn about who Jeff is and why we are having him on the show. But for now, we're going to just jump right in because we don't have enough time to dive deeply into our topic. So, Jeff, welcome to What's Possible in the Moment.
Great to be back.
So today's topic, and Jeff mentioned in our previous episode that I said, do not prepare because we want it to be an organic conversation. So, but he did give me a sneak peek on what he wants to talk about, and then it will be an organic conversation. So, Jeff, why don't you let the audience now have a sneak peek about what we're talking about?
Absolutely. So each time I enter one of the prisons, and this was what we discussed in our last conversation, I don't know where the conversation is going to lead. And on this particular day, I noticed we had the men in blue sit in a semicircle, and then we have songs and discussion and announcements and whatnot. And I happened to notice that everyone was sitting according to race. We had a line of Black inmates, Hispanic inmates, and then Caucasian inmates. And it caught my attention, and I really wanted to ask about it, but I wasn't sure if I was going to upset anybody if I did. So that's what I'd like to explore a little bit, because I did end up asking about that in one of our breakout sessions, and I was very surprised at the answer.
Yes, we're going to need to hear what the answer was, how you approach this, and I will let our listeners know. I do hope you go back to our original episode, but Jeff volunteers at a prison, and he ends up leaving with so much more than he probably feels like he gives. We end up serving, and then you take away so much in your heart, your soul, and just an expansion of perspective. And so what we're doing on these mini episodes is we are now learning from Jeff's experience as a serving as a volunteer capacity in the prisons. So, Jeff, how did you approach this conversation, and what was your takeaway?
Well, you're right, Eileen. There is the learning in the heart and the soul and the expansion of perspective, but also the application to the work world, the lessons learned in the
Thank you. Yeah.
process. So after we meet with all of the participants, and we may get 30 to 40 that join us either for one of our retreats or for what we call the monthly reunions, when we get together for 3 or 4 hours on a Saturday. And then we break out into small groups. And I tend to gravitate to groups that are as different from me as possible. So I tend to avoid the Caucasian and even the Hispanic. I speak Spanish, even the Hispanic inmates. And on this particular day, I found myself in a conversation with 6 of Black gentlemen, and we had some conversations, and I started asking them questions. We started talking about what it's like to live and survive in the prison, and how did they decide to join us for this gathering versus the men out in the yard who didn't join us, and what's the differentiation, and how do they behave in here versus out there, and what do they appreciate, and just asking questions and questions and questions. And finally, there was a pregnant pause, and I asked their permission. I said, look, I want to ask what might come across as a personal question. And that kind of piqued their curiosity. And I shared with them my observation about the division by race when they were all sitting. And the answer I got was so incredibly articulate, I'll never forget. What this gentleman said is that God created different races. We mix, we mingle. I'm comfortable going over and talking to Tommy or Joe or whoever it might be. But all things being equal, when I'm on my own, I'm going to go where I'm most comfortable. I'm going to go where people look like me and talk like me and whatnot. And what struck me about that is he then followed up and he said, it doesn't mean there's a problem. It's a habit. The problem isn't races staying separate from each other. The problem is one race trying to make itself better than another. And he quickly made the jump from that comment to then talking about actually one of the advantages they have in the prison is that they don't have economic privilege, that there's no
Oh,
differences in class in the
uh,
prison. There's certainly power struggles and things of that nature, but
sure.
there's not classism. And that was the phrase that he used, and how
Interesting.
different that is. And I started to think about the application to the work world. And what I reflected on was a study out of Stanford that showed that diverse teams, people of different thought, different experience, different education will outperform homogenous teams every time, but it takes more work for them to come together. And that's exactly what this gentleman was describing. It will take more
Yeah.
work. I have no problem with people of other race, but
Yeah.
it's not as natural for me, so I'm going to have to work a little bit harder to engage in those relationships and build those relationships. But then I have that added benefit, and in the work environment, we see that exponentially, with diverse teams, diverse thoughts outperforming those that, well, I'm going to hire someone from my alma mater. I'm going to hire someone from my company. I'm going to hire someone who thinks like me. I want those people on my team, but then I miss out on different opportunities and learnings.
Yeah. Gosh, wow. This is a big one. And, it does make me think about how our brains work and just being, tribal people who perceive safety and perceive that if I'm with people that look like me, I'm safe. And I mean, again, this is more from a tribal perspective, not in necessarily today's world. So it's that unconscious thing that we have that what I'm hearing is we need to obviously bring this to our consciousness because we do know the value in having whether it's diversity of thought, diverse colleagues on a variety of levels, and friendships and communities and everything. We could take it
Mhm.
outside of the workplace as well as inside. However, if our natural inclination is to gravitate to sameness, there needs to be that awareness and that attention to realize, hey, wait a second, I'm naturally doing this, even if it's unconscious. I need to bring it to my consciousness and how do I act and do differently because it serves me and in this case an organization well when I'm able to break out of that natural inclination.
Absolutely. And, an analogy I would offer is I was talking to a group of executives about the concept of feedback and safety. And I shared with them that they think that they are approachable, but they're not. And that has very little to do with their personality. In some cases, it might, but a lot of it has to do with power structure and has to do
Yeah.
with their titles, and that they expect that employees will come to them with feedback and candor, but they have to pave the way. They have to work hard to establish that. And in the same way, the power structure works in the prisons. There's
Yeah.
literally lines painted out on the yard where certain races stay in certain spots. And if you cross a line, you will be attacked.
Oh, wow.
So you really have to be very deliberate in forming these relationships and creating safety for someone to reach out to you to demonstrate that you are welcoming of it. And for me, that's the big takeaway is that it's not just about my outreach, but also my creating a safe environment for someone to reach out to me.
Mm. Yeah. How am I perceived? And
Mhm.
how do I welcome people into my little world, my own little world? How do I open the door to that? Because that's our own responsibility to open that door. We can't expect somebody to open a locked door, from the outside.
Absolutely. We frequently have said that it is an employee's responsibility to clarify their goals, to bring their challenges to their boss, et cetera. But it's the manager's responsibility to create the safe environment where the employee feels like they can have
Mhm.
those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this dovetails, which we can't go far down this path because of timing, but into belonging. How do I help somebody feel like they belong?
Mhm.
And how do we create that environment where people do actually belong versus just talk about it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And belonging being something that's very broad because I'll give you in the case of the prison, belonging can go too far, where someone gravitates to a gang situation
Yeah,
or the
yeah.
belonging, and belonging becomes at the expense of inclusion. So
Yes.
it's something that can get very complex in an
Oh,
environment like this, where people have to look out for their physical safety. And I also would say, and perhaps this is another topic, but we also have to be cautious about the corporate promises, the implicit and explicit promises we make about our environment and belonging, and we're a family and we're friends and things of that
yes.
nature, because we frequently can't live up to those expectations that we inadvertently may have created.
Very true. That actually, I do think we need another episode on that. So, as we wrap up this episode, how do you feel that a leader can apply this learning from the prison into their organization, whether it's on a larger scale in their organization or within their teams specifically?
If I was to identify, and again, this could be a long answer, but if I was to identify the one thing that I focused on and continue to focus on with leaders when I provide coaching, is to lead with vulnerability. Now, one thing that I've been doing some writing on the topic of vulnerability, not to steal or borrow any of Brene Brown's phenomenal work on the topic, but I looked up the definition of vulnerability and found that it was first used in the 1600s. And the definition was, to be vulnerable is to expose a wound. And it wasn't until the last 40 years or so that we used vulnerability in a positive light, as
Hmm.
something that would lead to belonging, inclusion, safety. So, as a leader, I'm going to be vulnerable to invite you to be vulnerable. But the challenge is that we have hundreds of years of DNA saying that vulnerability is dangerous. So there's no surprise that many leaders struggle with
Yeah.
this concept.
Yeah. So, what I hear is be vulnerable and be aware that you might struggle with it, but
Mhm.
still allow yourself to be vulnerable. And then I'll add in two more for our leaders to take away. And one is be aware of your natural inclination and biases.
Mhm.
And so that awareness can then open the door to being more intentional in thinking differently. And then going back to what Jeff said, there is research behind the importance of diversity of thought, and our organizations have the opportunity to benefit from that diversity of thought.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jeff Jacobs, for joining me on What's Possible. I look forward to our next one.
Thanks so much, Eileen.